Can we approve the minute? Do I have a second?
Motion to approve the minutes.
All in favor? Aye. First order of business is I believe, a terrific presentation. So I'll yield the floor.
Okay. So what we wanted to do tonight was to kind of try to run through this relatively quickly so that we have time for discussion afterwards. And I know Steve has a 5-minute addition to the presentation. But can everybody hear me okay?
Not really.
No. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the purpose of this meeting is to present the findings from the discovery report. So the project is in 3 phases. The first is the discovery, which is the existing conditions, and it's factual information. The next phase will be drill down when we do our analysis. And that's when we get input from you on some of the visioning. We'll do the visioning sessions. And then finally, we have the recommendation, the design of what we're recommending for your vision plan update. So tonight, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go into case studies. And then what I want to stress is that the case studies are examples that we collectively pulled out. It was recommendations from the Pinecrest Parkway Citizens Committee. It was recommendations from our design team, projects that are good examples, that are bad examples, so that we can kind of understand the different iterations and the different opportunities when we start looking at the vision plan and how the community would like to grow in the next 30 to 40 years. Next, we're going to do the demographics. We can give you sort of a quick snapshot of the market study that was done in 2021, which has a lot of good information and can inform our process. We're going to present the station area, information about employment and population. These station areas are 104th and 136th Street that are planned and approved and funded for the South Corridor, which is the bus rapid transit, which is already under construction down south. We'll do an overview of the current land development regulations because that informs a lot of what we're doing. And then we're gonna show you some of our findings and thoughts and then have discussion. So we're gonna start with some examples that you might be familiar with. This is Worth Avenue, and what I want to stress about Worth Avenue is that you have a gradation in the commercial district of heights and intensities and uses. And so the image on the left, can you all see this? Yes. Okay, just let me know if I'm blocking. The image on the left is showing an example of more of a commercial development that's not historic, with the parking on the side and the back, with a big median in front of it. But what I want to point out here is that you have the blue, which is the heavy density residential, and the medium density residential, which has a gradation of density and height. So you go from 2 stories to 5 stories. But in the purple area, which is just behind Worth Avenue, there are certain things that create setbacks and step downs and pedestrian paths, and those are all things that we might want to consider when we're looking at Pinecrest as a reference. These are some examples of another layer of information, which is the Worth Avenue design standards. So that's another opportunity that you have, is to look at the standards that you have now and try to how to make them more robust or change them in a way that reflects your current thinking of what you'd like to do. So for example, they have requirements for building setback lines so that your building is a little bit pushed forward, and you have parking in the back, and the example on the bottom left is the rear underground parking. So this is actually behind this building, and then you have a step down of buildings from 6 stories to 3 and 2, so that's an example of the transition, and then they have these paseos and courtyards. So it's an interesting example to look at as a reference. They also have something which is interesting, was off-site parking, so they allow it within 500 feet that you could have off-site parking. The other example that the committee wanted us to look at was Meisner Park. And so the interesting thing about Meisner Park is that it was developed as a master plan project, and it was next to a residential community. So these are all single family. And the requirement was they created this residential buffer strip, and they developed the residential first across the street from the single family, and that was a requirement of the development because they wanted to make sure that there was a transition to the single family. And that was done in the 80s. The single family lots are about 8,000 square feet. Another example, so this is an example of a community that has a bus rapid transit line, and these are two lines. This is Kansas City, Missouri. So what I want to point out about this particular project is that they have transit-oriented development policy. So they're creating these transit-oriented development areas around the stations. And what's interesting are the zones of protection. So you have a transition here in this example between the residential and the taller building with different setbacks, and you actually have a visibility line so that you can't perceive that building with what's shown as the protected zone. And then on the bottom, this is kind of a cut through of all the streets, and it shows you the gradation. And so they're keeping the taller buildings towards the corners, towards the edges, with the rail in the middle. They're creating a transition of uses and different types of green space so that you're transitioning from a 4-story to a 2-story residential. Okay, another example we wanted to share was Dallas, because it's also a suburban, they have a lot of suburban residential buildings. This is their Dallas area rapid transit. And here again, similar to what they did in Missouri, is they created these different areas. So they have the area for public space, a mix of uses, again with the off-street parking, but within a quarter-mile radius is where they're having all of the development, and then it starts to scale down and transition. And those transitions are really important as we begin to think about future growth. In this example, I want to stress this was an example that the village does not support, but the committee wanted to understand what Coral Gables did to get that development. So it's a couple of things. First of all, this building, this is the US one, this is with the Trader Joe's building. This building has a 90% lot coverage, which means that 90% of the property can have a building on it. So you get this big, massive, bulky building. The other thing that they did was they provided opportunities for increased FAR and height. So the base height is 9, and if you do certain Mediterranean style improvements and they have standards, you can go up additional 2 stories and additional 1 story. That gets you to an FAR of 3.5. They also have exemptions for setbacks, and they have exemptions for parking. So you get a very large, massive building, which is, we know we don't want this. But the reason why this is important to see is because you can compare it. And so we know that this is way too much, this is way too high. And then Pinecrest, we wanted to show, is a similar in scale to a lot of these different communities that we showed, but it's part of a larger regional transportation plan. That's important to understand. The SMART plan is 6 lines of a corridor transportation. It's either bus rapid transit or light rail, metro rail, and then it's overlaid with bus express rapid transit, which are buses that connect for the first and last mile. So you get off of your station, and then there's an express bus that will take you to another destination. So it's a very comprehensive plan. Much of it is funded, or in the process of being funded, in the process of being developed. So this is going to happen. And Pinecrest fits into that somehow, and that's what we're talking about with this project. The demographics are important too. So there was a market study that was done in 2021. It shows your population was 18,000, with just a little bit of growth in 2021. This is an important slide because it talks about income. So Pinecrest has a very high income compared to Miami-Dade County. So Miami-Dade is shown on the bottom compared to Pinecrest. When you look at residential, the market studies showed that demand is very high. And I believe this market analysis is online if you wanted to dig deeper into it. The demand is very high for residential. The condo market did see an increase in demand, and there's a slightly upward trend in renter-occupied housing. In terms of retail and office, you do have 2.3 million square feet of retail. You haven't had a lot of new product since 2014. Office is a little bit of a lower number, 440,000. But the office was performing strongly before COVID-19. And so what do we do with all this information? So it's really, how do you fill in the gaps? So what's interesting about this is that you have high incomes, you have high disposable income, but you're spending your money outside of Pinecrest. So there's a gap, and there's an opportunity to have retail, restaurant, office that the community can use. Instead of going across the street, instead of going up to Coconut Grove or South Miami, it can happen here. And this pie chart is showing the different businesses. And so the highest is professional services, retail, trade, and food. But what's interesting about the food is that it only represents 6.7% of your business tax receipts. So not a lot of money is being generated right now by food and beverage. This is an analysis that was done by the county, and the reason why I want to show it to you is because there was a question about future growth. If you had transit, if you didn't have transit, what would it be? So right now, well, when this was done in 2015, the residents were 2,579, and you had 2,500 employees. The region uses a model. Everybody uses it. It's the standard. It's called SERPM, and they generate population employment projections for 2040. So using those population projections, if nothing were to change, you would have 700 more residents and 1,000 more employees within this half-mile radius. So the half-mile radius includes the county. It's both sides of the street. But that's how the growth trend would be. I think we're going to have questions at the end. For 136th Street, you have a little bit of a larger change. So the growth, the projected growth, which is the model that the county uses, that's the agreed upon model, growth trend, is 1,800 residents and 4,200 employees. What's interesting about both of these is that for 104th Street, this can handle, so what is available now in terms of the zoning for the Pinecrest and for the county can be absorbed by the future transit, meaning there's no need to change the zoning to accommodate the projected growth and employment with the transit scenario. The transit scenario is not shown here. 136th Street is more or less the same. So if you did nothing with your zoning, you would still have enough room to put all the people that are projected with the new transit land use scenario. In terms of your current land use, you have 3 layers. So your first layer is your underlying zoning. And on the Pinecrest Parkway corridor, generally you have 2 to 4 stories. Some places allow 2, some places allow 4. You can do up to 0.73 FAR when you get to the 4 stories. You have a very high parking requirement. you have a very low lot coverage. So if you think about the Coral Gables example, at 90%, yours is 40. But you do have certain areas that are residential multifamily that have high densities. You have 50 dwelling units per acre, 36 dwelling units per acre, and 20. When you get to the North Pinecrest Business Alternative District, so that's what's shown, you have 3 in the orange. That allows you to have mixed use, which is residential, in a commercial district where it's not allowed anywhere else. It allows you to go up to 4 stories. In most cases, you can already go up to 4 stories. It allows you to go up to 0.73 FAR, which is what's allowed now in most of the other zoning districts. It allows you to go up to 12 dwelling units per acre, so your density goes down compared to some of your other residential districts. And you're limited to 25% residential. So in your building, you can't do more than 25% residential. And it's a conditional use, so it has to be reviewed and approved separately. Your Pinecrest Parkway corridor development standards apply to the entire corridor except for those North Pinecrest Business Alternative Districts. And generally what that plan did was create a standard and an expectation for development that was going to be more connected with village walkways, with pathways, with more green space. The separation of you can see in the red, which was what faces the parkway, and in the back, which faces the residential. But so far, you've had 3 projects that have built to that standard. Now this is a requirement. One of the more significant things of this is an 8-foot wide buffer. So fronting Pinecrest Parkway, you have to have an 8-foot landscape buffer. So I've touched on this throughout the presentation, but these are sort of the findings or the takeaways from the research that we did. You have a very high requirement for open space, and you have a very high requirement for parking. Parking is required between the buildings. So if you look back at this image, you have parking lots on the sides and between each building. Structured parking is allowed, but it's not clear. It's a conditional use, but the height is not clear, so that might need to be looked at. And then your residential on the corridor is limited to 25%. So Matt Manda is going to go through the analysis that we did in terms of the actual massing.
Thanks, Melissa. So the diagrams that we're going to share with you here in a second, you're probably asking yourself, all right, that's a lot of great information, but what does this look like? These diagrams are going to help you visualize that. And the thing that I want to point out is these aren't concepts, so we're not proposing anything. What we're doing is basically taking what the code says and applying that to 3 different conditions along the corridor to see what we could get from a development standpoint. The idea is that as we get into the next phase, which would be some of the design iteration, understanding what works and what doesn't work. And these diagrams, I think, are going to help you see that, because there's a lot of text, there's a lot of overlap, as Melissa was saying, from the underlying versus the different overlays of the corridor or the business development district. That can get confusing. So the first one that we're going to look at here is the northernmost, which is the Dayland North and South stations, and it's this triangle piece right here. Currently, there's a CVS on there and some other big box retail and FedEx. The next. It's zoned as the North Pinecrest Business Alternative District's BU1A, which is general business. It requires a 20-foot setback plus the 8-foot buffer that Melissa was mentioning along the corridor. We also have a side setback off of 88 of 15 feet, a 30-foot rear off of 68. So that starts to cut up some of our area. And we also have the Pinecrest Parkway overlay of 40%. So when we start to look at what we can do here, Melissa kind of touched on a few things, right? The parking requirements is high. The open space also as well, right? The requirement of having, especially along the corridor, parking on the sides of the building instead of the back starts to lend itself to a certain type of development pattern. Largely, as you can see here, along the parkway, all the buildings are generally 1 story with parking associated to the side, and we also have the required open space. As we get further into the site, you start to see that on this back corner here, we get a second story, which in this case, I think we have as a residential there, that's supported by a first floor retail. We also have a smaller retail piece off of 68, and then some office space down here in the corner. Again, all associated or taking into account the open space requirements of parking unit. Melissa mentioned the idea or the thought of possibly having structured parking. We did look at a scenario that showed that, but because that was a conditional use, we put that aside and looked at just what the zoning has as a fair comparison to apples and apples. So this, if we were to redevelop this parcel, this is what you could expect as far as the type of development here, right? You can see that we're only 2 stories max, which is on the back side, the north side, adjacent to the multifamily. And predominantly everything else is generally 1 story. You want to show us what the views? Yeah, so these are just different views. The other thing to note is there's also a requirement for step backs. So when we start going up floors, we have to require step backs of, I think it's 15 to 10. I think it's 15 foot for the second floor, and it goes back to 10 for the third and fourth. So again, this is following the text to the letter, right, and the different overlays as well. The next parcel we're going to look at is the 104th Street Station. This one's a little bit more challenging. This one, as you can see, the lot size is much smaller. And in this section of the parkway, as we continue to go south, we tend to have that type of development where the lots are really shallow. That presents some challenges when it comes to redeveloping those because of what we can and can't do based on the zoning requirements. Next. So similar to the previous one, it's both general business. There's the commercial development and then the general business here as well. We do have, again, the same 20-foot setback with an 8-foot landscape buffer. We also have a 25-foot setback because we're adjacent to residential. What's also not shown on here is the rear setback, which is 20, and then the side yard, which is 5, I believe.
And the residential is behind.
And the residential is also behind. And so here you can see that from a development standpoint, it's quite limited. Again, because the open space requirements that they have to have and the parking requirements, we're generally able to get 1 floor of office. In this case, 1 floor of office with parking associated to that. So there's not much opportunity to do much else as far as getting height or volume or anything like that. We do provide, as part of this buffer, a green space back there to screen from the residential and from the parking lot and office building as well. The last parcel we're going to look at is the 36th Street, which has obviously the Home Depot, Publix, and Macy's. For this exercise, we're pretty much going to look at the Home Depot site here as well, okay? So similar, again, this is general business, but it's general business 2. So I think, I can't quite call what those metrics are.
Right, that's large scale retail, alcohol, it's basically like alcohol sales.
So in this scheme, and this, again, you still have the same setbacks, the 20-foot and the landscape buffer along Pinecrest Parkway. We have 15 here off 136. There's a 20 rear setback as it backs up onto the residential. And we have a side internal setback of 20 as it relates to Publix. In this scheme here, we kept Home Depot as is. The development that's just to the south, I think that's Office Depot, I think. Has been removed, and that's accommodating the parking that's needed from Home Depot, which basically gives us the front half to really develop and try to make, in this scheme, we try to make it something that feels more like a town center development, right? Trying to densify as much as possible. Again, what you can see here, again, with the 12% open space requirement and parking that we have, all the buildings here are generally 1 story, right? There's more opportunity and more space to develop, but you're not getting much height in this scenario. You're getting a lot more space for restaurants and cafes, that sort of thing. You also have a lot more open space that can be planned in as a placemaking opportunity, enhanced character. But generally speaking, you're not getting much volume and much height from any development in this. Do we have another view of this? That's it. Yeah. So here's another view. This is 136. North is to the top of the page. We are suggesting here that we come in here with a dedicated sort of Main Street feel to kind of provide a little more ease of access.
So we're going to save the discussion until after Steve makes his presentation, but generally, these are the kinds of things that we'd like to discuss tonight. What do you envision for Pinecrest Parkway? How does parking and open space and lot coverage begin to shape the new development? When you think about placemaking, what does that look like? Do you want to encourage redevelopment or keep things the way they are? And what should the station area look like? Should it change? So Steve, what do you think?
I was going to say one thing too. We have a sign-in sheet online. We definitely want to make sure everybody signs in tonight. Email address as well, so that we can communicate with you for further updates as we go along the process. If you haven't signed in, just come up here and we'll make sure we get your information in.
Hold on one second, I need to log in. This laptop.
Mr. Olmsted,
Yes.
somebody asked who these folks were that weren't introduced. Maybe you should introduce the city employees.
I'd like to say that I'm a citizen of Pinecrest. This is the first meeting I've been to. I'm not really up to speed on a lot of these things. I'm absorbing a lot of information here at one time. I don't know who a single person here is. I don't know what your credentials are. I would think that before you give a presentation, you should at least say who you are, what your credentials are, so us ignorant citizens can evaluate the information that's being presented to us.
Well, maybe I can help. This is the Pinecrest Parkway Citizens Committee that was appointed by the Village Council. And they can introduce themselves. It consists of architects and landscape architects and
Okay.
experts in land use planning.
Okay?
And I'm
That's good.
Steve Olmsted. I'm the planning director for the Village of Pinecrest. I graduated from the University of Michigan with a master's degree in urban planning in 1983, and I've been working in the profession for 40 years. I've been with Pinecrest for the last 12 years. We've hired consultants to facilitate this process. That's MHCP Collab and Matt Manda, an architect, Melissa Hagee, Matt Hagee, and et cetera. So
Okay,
this is the
people
team.
over on this side are kind of part of a company that's acting as a consulting
Yes.
group. And your name is Steve Olmsted?
I'm Steve Olmsted. I'm an employee of the village.
And how long has this committee been in existence?
I'm going to stop right there. I'm going to give you a set of our talking points. This will give you all the background of how all this started,
Okay.
how we got here, what we're discussing, all the history of it, and the generally frequently asked questions about the entire process.
Great.
All right.
And I just had that one last question.
This is all online too,
How
with
long
the
has
Village
been-
of
how long
Pinecrest
has been,
website.
About a month and a half, I believe.
A month and a half for this particular...
Committee.
Here.
This is what.
Oh, well, then I don't feel so stupid.
You're right in.
This is the third meeting, and we've only had, this is the third meeting, and we haven't met every 4 weeks.
Well, Well,
June 7th is our first meeting.
so I guess, it makes sense to know who's making the presentation.
Absolutely.
So just for the benefit of everybody in the audience, the village council worked with staff and consultants in preparing the Pinecrest Parkway US 1 Vision Plan in 2012, which was 10 years ago. So the plan is now 10 years out of, it's
Okay.
still being implemented, it's in force, it's 10 years old. And in that 10 years' time, conditions have changed. The bus rapid transit system is planned for the west side of Pinecrest Parkway along the busway, so there have been changing conditions, and it only makes sense, staff believes, the village council believes, to update that plan. We have new socioeconomic data, we have changing conditions. A lot of it is working well. I'd say most of it is working well. So the purpose of this committee is to decide whether or not to look at that plan and recommend changes to the village council to amend it and update it going forward.
Is it customary that members of the village council do not attend these meetings?
Yes, that's customary, but they're certainly welcome to attend. They have appointed this committee, and they get reports on a monthly basis in terms of the progress and the attendance and things like that. And ultimately, this committee will make a recommendation to
I
the
just
village
have one
council.
last question at this point. The woman, I'm sorry. I didn't
Melissa
catch her-
Heggie.
I'm sorry?
Melissa Heggie.
Melissa said that there would be an opportunity for us citizens out here
Yeah.
to ask questions.
Yes,
You know what time that's going to be?
I don't know what time it's going to be, but it's toward the end of the agenda.
So we
just
don't know
depends.
how long we're going to have to be here.
We'd like to end around 8 o'clock. But we have a lot to get through, and there will be an opportunity to make comments and ask questions for sure.
Okay, this seems to run along the style of Pinecrest meetings.
All right?
I have a question. I know that a lot of people that attended last time, I was not able, complained there's no microphones. People requested microphones. Why aren't there microphones?
I'm not sure, they're just not available. I asked for microphones, and we don't have a PA system in this room. We have other rooms, but I don't know if, can people hear us at the back of the room?
On and off.
On and
On and
off?
off.
Okay, we'll speak loudly then. I want to get on with the rest of the presentation if I may, and we'll have an opportunity for your questions on the agenda, most definitely. So I wanted to advise the committee of the Rapid Transit Zone ordinance that has been passed at first reading by the Miami-Dade County Board of Commissioners. At first reading was passed on June 1st. And so the question is, how is this ordinance going to impact the municipalities in Miami-Dade County? And how is it going to impact Miami-Dade County? Because it does apply to both Miami-Dade County and all of the municipalities within Miami-Dade County. So most of the requirements of the Rapid Transit Zone ordinance apply to unincorporated Miami-Dade County. The village will maintain jurisdiction over all development within the village, including review procedures. That's the second draft I'm talking about that was approved at first reading on June 1st. And it's scheduled for final review and adoption on September 1st. The village will maintain control of its land use and zoning and jurisdiction over all development within the village with an important exception. The village will continue to regulate building height and residential density. The required plan, however, must demonstrate that how the village will meet the minimum floor area ratio requirements of the ordinance. The ordinance allows municipalities to protect single-family and two-family residential neighborhoods. They are specifically excluded from the ordinance. Municipalities have the option to demonstrate to Miami-Dade County how our ordinance is going to comply with the minimum standards of the proposed ordinance. And we have until July 31st, 2024 to develop a plan to take to the county. The ordinance requires development of a plan, taking it to the county for review and approval. That's what this ordinance provides. To July 31st, 2024. So So a lot of people understand exactly what floor area ratio is, some people do not. So for the benefit of those who don't, floor area ratio is basically a mathematical computation where you take the area of the building, all the floors in the building, the floor area, add it up, first floor, second floor, third floor, however tall the building is. You get a certain number of square feet of floor area, and you divide that by the site area. So if you have 10,000 square foot lot, for example, and you have a one-story building that's 10,000 square feet in area, obviously it wouldn't be very attractive. It would be taking up the entire lot area, lot line to lot line to lot line, but that would be a floor area ratio of 1.0. So in order to get an attractive development with some green space, you're obviously going to have to go a little higher. The second column, the first column shows you 0.5 floor area ratio. So here's your site, and it's occupied, half of it's occupied by one-story building. That's a floor area ratio of 0.5. This is a floor area ratio of 1.0. It would occupy the entire site with a one-story building, or half of the site with a two-story building. And here's an example of 1.5 floor area ratio. Half of the site with a three-story building, or the entire site with a 1.5-story building. So it's really, you take the floor area ratio, you take the floor area, you take and you understand the size of the lot, and you get a floor area ratio by dividing building area by the site area. So again, if you have a 10,000 square foot lot and 5,000 square feet of floor area, that's a floor area ratio of 0.5. If you have a 10,000 square foot lot and you have a multi-story building with 20,000 square feet of floor area, that's a floor area ratio of 2, okay? It's important to understand because the county ordinance does require minimum floor area ratios, and that's all that it regulates to the extent that we can accomplish that and not harm the adjoining single-family residential neighborhoods. So the ordinance, and this map is taken right from Miami-Dade County's Comprehensive Development Master Plan, the future land use map. This is their map, not ours. And it shows these community urban centers, these circles here. There's one here in Pinecrest at 136th Street. There's one up here. And there's one up here just south of the C-100 canal. And what that does is it requires, within this core area, you have a minimum floor area ratio of 1.5 in the center, graduating down to 0.5 at the edges. You can see in Pinecrest, it's going to be 0.5 at the edge because the center is outside of Pinecrest. Same here and same here. So basically, you're talking about a floor area ratio in here that 0.5 to maybe up to 1, just depends.
Steve, can I ask a quick question? I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying. The RTZ ordinance and the FAR required by that, that we are supposed to meet, only applies to those little circular areas?
No.
Okay. That's
The 1.5 floor area ratio applies to the center of the urban centers, and then it graduates down to the edge to 0.5, but it goes further. Within a quarter mile of the smart corridor, and this blue strip is a quarter mile. Within that quarter mile, this is US 1. This blue is the quarter mile strip. You see the red, those are the commercially zoned properties for the most part. In that area, the ordinance requires or allows for a floor area ratio of 1.0 to the extent that it can be accommodated without harming the adjoining single-family residential neighborhoods. So if somebody came in with a plan to develop any of these properties at a floor area ratio of 1.0, we would be particularly concerned about heights and setbacks and impacts on all of this residential area to the east. any residential area that immediately abuts those commercial buildings. We also have setback requirements and green space requirements. So it's doubtful that they would be able to develop on every single commercial property in Pinecrest a floor area ratio of 1.0. And this goes from south to north. So you have up here 88th Street, and it comes all the way down to 136th Street right here. This is Home Depot, going north all the way up to the canal, 88th Street.
So that blue area there, you have there shade, that's a half mile, right? So
No, it's a quarter mile.
Quarter mile.
It's a quarter mile, and there are single-family residences in this quarter mile. Those are all specifically excluded from the ordinance. So the 1.0 floor area ratio does not apply to any of the residentially zoned property. That is excluded. It only applies to the commercial properties, to the extent that it can be developed without harming the single-family residences to the east. And then the ordinance, I don't think this is going to apply to us. The ordinance further allows a 0.5 floor area ratio, a half mile from this corridor. But as you can see in the last photograph, the 1/4 mile wide buffer comes out to about here where my hand is, and all the rest of this to the east for the second quarter mile is residential. So again, the 0.5 floor area ratio would not apply because residential properties are specifically excluded. Excuse me?
Quarter mile would be Wood Avenue, half mile would be what? It's already been diagonal. It's already done.
This is 80th Avenue here, I believe.
Okay.
This is southwest. Well, yeah, that's 80th Avenue for reference purposes.
Hey, Steve. On the picture on the right, what are the two blocks away from the buffer zone? The two blue blocks?
These are schools. This is Gulliver up here, and then this is Miami Palmetto Senior High, and these are the elementary school down on the south side.
And can those be developed?
We have very specific requirements for schools that have all kinds of requirements for open space, for parking, for playground area, and all the rest. So Gulliver is probably now developed at a floor area ratio of 0.78, something like that, I believe. They would not be able to further develop that property because of the requirements. I think they're pretty much developed to the maximum capacity because of the amount of open space that is required to be provided. They've redeveloped, they have plans for the redevelopment of that property, and I think that's about as much as they're ever going to be able to develop on that property. Yes?
So if I understand the issue, it seems that all the single family is exempt of these FAR requirements. So the challenge here is how to design the business culture to achieve the average that is required on the resolution of mandate that they have. And that's the challenge with the commercial culture. Pretty much everything else is exempt of this issue.
Yeah, everything else is exempt. And when it comes to floor area ratio, I wanted to point out that for a one-story building, our code currently allows for 0.40% FAR approximately, and then it increases by, I think it's 11% for every additional story. So you get to 0.73, something thereabouts. Maximum, I've got them here, it's 0.40, then it goes to 0.51, then 0.62, and I think the maximum is 0.73. 0.73 is for a 4-story building. So the difference between 0.73 and 1.0 is, you know,
So basically, the challenge is see how much will be the height of the building by the commercial boulevard to,
exactly.
comply with FAR. Have you done any calculations about that, maybe like 5 stories max or something like that?
Well, I'll tell you, in an earlier planning exercise, a document that staff developed, we're initially recommending that if the village council is going to increase heights and densities, and this is an initial recommendation, it's in the hands of the committee and the consultants now, of course, but we were initially thinking it would make sense if you're going to allow for additional height and you're going to allow for additional FAR, why not do it at 136th Street where the transit station is going to be? Why not do it at 104th Street? And why not do it up in the north part of the village where you're already allowing multifamily at 50 units per acre? And all of that would be consistent with the recommendations of our comprehensive plan, which allows up to 25 units per acre adjacent to transit. That would seem, from a staff standpoint, just unofficially, that would seem to be logical to allow it in those locations where you're going to have the traffic and the transit, and you've got the opportunity for that. Now, that's the job of this committee to decide whether or not they're going to recommend anything over 4 stories, or if they're going to recommend and how they're going to accommodate that 1.0 FAR, which is in the county ordinance. The one that was adopted June 20.
4 FAR? 4.0?
No, 1.0 FAR.
The county?
It's in the county ordinance.
Oh, that's fine.
But we're not
And
in
if
that,
I
we're on the edge, so we're only at 0.5 within the RTC.
No.
No. Didn't you just say that only the edge of the RTC?
No, I didn't. That's not what I said. Let me just review one more time.
Okay.
There are 3 zones within the RTC ordinance. Community urban centers, as defined by Miami-Dade County on their future land use map, and this is their map. There's a circle there. That is a community urban center. This is a community urban center. And this is a community urban center. And you can see those circles. 3/4 of this is outside of Pinecrest, but this 1/4, the northeast corner of 136 and US 1, is. And within a community urban center, the floor area ratio ranges from 0.5 at the edge to 1.5 in the center. Now, the center is really outside of Pinecrest, so it goes from, say, 0.5 to 1.0, I mean, for just discussion purposes this evening, in those portions of the circle that are within Pinecrest. You have one at US 1 between Kendall Drive and Stafford Creek Canal, you have one at Dadeland South Metro Rail Station, and you have one down here at 136th Street. That's the first area that the ordinance discusses and talks about FAR. There are 2 others. Within a 1/4 mile of the SMART corridor, that's this blue area, single-family residence is excluded. Within a 1/4 mile, they will allow a floor area ratio of 1.0. That encompasses all of the commercial properties in Pinecrest.
But that's subject to negative impact on the surrounding residential community and is downsized accordingly, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
And then there's a third provision in the ordinance that further allows a floor area ratio of 0.5 between a 1/4 mile and a 1/2 mile of the corridor.
Which would never affect us because it's all residential.
It won't affect us because it's residential, that's correct.
Okay.
And this corridor that you see in blue extends over to the west side as well. Same things. Well, no, I think in unincorporated county, actually, you can have more intensive development.
So I have 2 questions. The stations that are going to be built, where are they actually going to be located in relationship to US 1?
Very close to 136th Street, right in here. At 104th Street. Where's 104th? This is Yeah, adjacent to the busway, and then up here at Dadeland.
So the
Metro Rail.
my question really is, how much of that station is going to actually be on Pinecrest property? How much of it's going to be on the other side of the highway?
The station itself will not be in Pinecrest, it's going to be on the west side of the parkway.
Okay, and, you know, just to kind of summarize, the county's initial idea of the density that they wanted to have within a quarter mile and a half mile of the corridor was going to be very high. And then, of course, we got all this stuff exempted, which is a good thing for Pinecrest. But can we expect to see high-rises going up on the other side? Because they're going to have to compensate for what they can't do on our side, on the other side. And
Well,
you
what
see
they
it
built
as-
in Miami, I don't know how to answer that question. In Miami-Dade County, yet they are planning for some high-density development around the stations on the west side of the.
I'm sure they are.
They're doing it.
And it's happening all the way down towards Homestead, I believe.
So, yes, that initial ordinance, I know Mayor Corradino was involved, the League of Cities was involved, staff reviewed it, and it became apparent that what was being recommended was not going to be in the best interest of Pinecrest, and luckily, the mayor and others lobbied the county, and they came up with this revised ordinance that is just dramatically better. It does allow for a 1.0 floor area ratio on the commercial properties instead of a maximum of 0.73, so that is an increase in intensity where it can be accommodated, but it is far less impactful than what would otherwise have been.
And what is the term of the new ordinance that is passed in September? 5 minutes, or a year, or 10 years, or 20?
You know, that's a good question. I'm going to have to research that. We have 2 years to develop a plan from the time it's adopted till July, the end of July 2024. 2 years is when we need to take a plan for their review and approval. So we're not going to be impacted, you know, until that plan is adopted.
And so what if we said we don't want a plan? What's the option there? Like you said, we would all agree with what you're doing.
If you told Miami-Dade County that we're not interested and your ordinance that you just passed, we're not going to implement it, I don't know. I don't know what the impact would be.
But Steve.
Likely there would be lawsuits and I can imagine there might be. I don't know who would file those suits and who would challenge us, but I don't know.
Steve, just 2 questions real quick. With a 0.73 FAR on most of those red properties, we're already almost in compliance with the 1.0 FAR that may be required on some of those properties, depending on where they are in the circle, correct?
Correct, yes.
All right, second question is, let's use the Home Depot site for an example. And let's say it's the edge of the Home Depot site is on the edge of the circle. Does the density on that piece of property go up as you go towards US 1? And is there a dividing line? This is 0.5, this is 0.75, this is 0.1?
No, it doesn't say, it just says 1.5 at the center, which is going to be west of US 1.
And 0.5 at the edge?
0.5 at the edge.
But doesn't this determine how you determine where the intervening 3/4 point falls?
Not that I'm aware of. You know.
There's no way colors, so it's very hard to find where they are.
So apparently, September 1st is when the final plan will be finalized? Or the
It's my
ordinance-
understanding that the Miami-Dade County Board of County Commissioners is scheduled to take action at second reading on September 1st. That's subject to change. I mean, that's the latest information I have.
Well,
Okay.
it's postponed to July, right?
What's that?
It's postponed it anyway, right? It was supposed to be in July.
I don't know.
Yeah, he's just saying they postponed it already from July to September.
Okay. So I wanted the committee to be aware of what this ordinance allows for and how it is going to have somewhat of an impact. Now, is the county, if we take a plan to the county that shows a 0.5 FAR on 90% of the properties and a 1.0 FAR on a couple? Are they going to ask for higher floor area ratios on those other properties to compensate? I don't know the answer to that question.
So I have a question, there's several questions for you. So these are the milestones that we have to deal with.
Right.
And the current Pinecrest criteria that was addressed in the previous presentation.
We have to hear
First-
you.
Yeah, I can't hear you back here.
And it's stand up.
Stand up.
Just imagine if I had to do this with a mask, so, you know. Hey, so the question that I have, the Pinecrest criteria that we have for open space and green area, right now, that's already established as the rule, right?
Yes.
So we have to incorporate into the FAR the factors of the parking criteria, front setbacks, side setbacks, basement setbacks, as well as parking and green area into this master plan.
Right.
So, and I just wanted to put that out there, that there's all these other things that we're going to stack into this. So in the event that we want to comply with the 1.0, but we have all of these other aspects that doesn't make that necessarily possible.
That's a good question. I mean, we got this ordinance from the county, we've reviewed it, we've been trying to understand it. I mean, what would happen if you said, I know you guys want us to comply with the 1.0 FAR, but we've got these very stringent setback requirements and green space requirements, and all the most we can get is 0.20. I think they'd probably object. You know, I think they're expecting something close to 1.0.
My intent is not necessarily to create the worst case scenario,
No.
but I do think that considering that the green and open space criteria and the notions of these pathways and all these things you want to do, it's going to, you know, you may want to shoot for 1.5 or 1 or 0.73, but in a very small lot, you will never really get past 1 or 2 floors.
That's
Once
true.
you incorporate, as an architect, and I'm an architect.
Okay, good.
All right, and so to me, the snake in the weeds is the parking criteria. So if you have mixed-use parking criteria and you, just for argument's sake, that's a requirement and it's 2 per dwelling unit, you know? That's gonna limit nearly all those other smaller parking. It doesn't become feasible when you do the math problem, the financial problem for all of those smaller units
That's correct.
to get there.
Right.
So we may be knocking out the majority of the strip just by maintaining certain percentages,
Correct.
right?
Yep.
So I'm putting that out there more as a conversational piece, because I think that there are certain things that we can do that would create more green space. So, for example, below grade parking, for example. So then you have plenty of green space, but everything's underground, and you can have plenty of landscape and so forth. So there's ways of tackling that opportunity.
Right.
Because it's a design opportunity, right?
Yeah.
So-
Baptist Health is one of the projects, Pinecrest Shops is another, and Lexus of Kendall pre-owned building is a very attractive building that's going to be on that property on the north side of the C-100 canal owned by the Bean Automotive Group. That plan has been approved and they're just going through some requirements of platting before they start construction. But those are 3 nicely developed, attractive developments that have developed under our current Pinecrest Parkway US 1 vision plan years ago. And I think Baptist is 4 stories. They're pretty much maxed out in terms of what the code allows them to do. They're at 0.73 FAR, I believe. So, but that's what this ordinance provides. It's a learning process. I mean, we have had conversations with Nathan Cogan, the planning director in Miami-Dade County, and I know others on the village council have been in touch, and things like that, in trying to understand all of this. We just provided this review to the village council on July 13th, I think it was. So, yes, sir.
That's it. If I recall, the main goal of the ordinance behind the ordinance was for residential. It wasn't that much for commercial. They were the way to tackle the housing that we have. So I think that the goal of the county was to increase density to manage residential development. That's my understanding. And I don't know if the core and center and edge regulation of the county applies to the city. In other words, on the core of 136, the county allows 125 units an acre, and the other edge is 90 units an acre. So I think the issue is more in the height than the FAR. I think the FAR is not that much of an issue, that the density and the height restrictions that the ordinance can impose on. But I don't know if you have any information for that.
Your question one more time?
Yeah, I mean, do we have the information about what it would be the density on residential and the height restrictions on the core and the edge? So the county and the orange center allows in the core, I think, 125 units an acre.
Yeah.
And
No,
the
we're
county-
not required to include mixed use, although it might make sense at certain locations. The county ordinance doesn't mandate a residential component. We do allow mixed use residential and commercial now within the North Pinecrest Business Alternative Districts, as Melissa indicated, 12 units per acre with commercial and a mixed use type development. And there are some very attractive mixed use developments around, and contrary to what people might believe, it's not low income housing.
No.
I mean, I'm familiar with a couple mixed use developments, and the units there sell for well over $1 million a piece.
No, and I don't think the issue of affordable housing or low cost or what have you. I think the issue may be that if you get the Home Depot site,
Yeah.
somebody buys the whole parcel and you do the local FAR, then you can just put a building that is very high, compared with FAR, but that's probably the issue that most of the residents may have.
Right.
You know, the development, you don't have a 136, and it may happen. So I don't know if that, this ordinance cover that, or the village will take the community for that.
It just says floor area ratio of 1.0, and so I think we have to be careful to develop regulations that allow for something close to 1.0 FAR without, something that respects 4 to 6 stories in height. I mean, I don't, whatever Pinecrest would support.
All right.
I have a question, or a comment. The Lexus building that's there down on the south side of the canal, I did the air conditioning there probably 15 years ago. It was always interesting because they went below surface level to accommodate more parking. And I know there's a certain elevation there might be a certain elevation in other parts of it. Would that help as far as the parking situation if we look at going down somewhat for additional parking under the building?
Yeah, I think it would, and also to allow rooftop parking, which we do
Right.
allow. And in the city of Naples, I just wanted to mention to the committee, you might find it interesting. I know they have a program called Parking in Lieu of Parking, PILOP. And it allowed property owners to contribute to a fund that was used to build 2 municipal parking garages. And in return for that contribution, they paid for their parking spaces. The parking structure was built so the parking spaces are there within proximity, but on the property itself, they didn't have to provide all the parking on the surface, so that allowed them to develop a more attractive development along 5th Avenue South. You may be familiar with that, and 3rd Street in Naples. It was those parking garages, the requirement that property owners, if they wanted to develop or redevelop in accordance with the new regulations, they had to pay, and I don't know exactly how much, I'm sure it was a substantial amount of money, into a fund that was used then to build parking garages in lieu of providing those parking spaces on their property. I don't know if that makes sense in Pinecrest with the linear US 1. US 1 obviously is quite a bit different in terms of the traffic and the strip
so
development.
more compact, that's a whole different thing I have with housing.
Right.
The fifth is so much more compact and 3rd both that may function well over there, but you'd be talking about those parking garages all up and down the highway here.
Right. So obviously, It would need to be somewhere that made sense in a more of a center. And that's something else that the village has been considering. Is it possible to create a community urban center somewhere that's less linear, but given the narrow width of these properties, there are only limited opportunities for that.
10 blocks versus several miles. Question, is there any numbers out there? So we have a .74 FAR limit now, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Are there any numbers out there on how many of the affected properties on the corridor are already at that?
No, we don't. It's not, many of them are less than .74. Baptist is close to .74. Others developed in the 1950s and 60s and was more suburban, less urban back then, obviously part of Miami-Dade County. I don't think there was a demand for the development back then, so you've got these shopping centers that have built as a result. I don't know exactly, to answer your question, no, I don't. I can give you a range. I've got that in my office, and a number of properties are less than .74, obviously, yes. Yeah.
I have a number of questions. Number one, I understand that one of the provisions of the ordinance is that abutting properties will not be affected by any development on the smart zone, is that right?
Correct, they're exempt, they're excluded.
As I read the information I've seen, 136th Street is made up of 3 different parcels. The Home Depot parcel, the Office Max parcel, and the bank parcels.
That's right.
So almost that entire 26 acres is abutting the single-family homes right behind it. Does that exempt that entire piece of property?
No, it doesn't exempt the entire piece of property. It exempts the residential properties. It does not exempt the commercial properties. It allows for development on the commercial properties, but it allows the village to put into place restrictions and standards that protect the residences to the east. So you wouldn't have a 6-story building towering over a single-family residential structure 30 feet away.
So let me ask you a different question. And I'm not a land developer. I don't have FAR for this part. Can you tell me what is anticipated to be allowed under the county ordinance that we are required to adopt? How many stories, how many units, how many something? So people have an idea of what can be put on that piece of property, for example, the 26 acres on 136th Street.
And I'm thinking to get a floor area ratio of 1.0, you might need 5 to 6 stories. I'm just guessing. I'm just, I haven't sat down with an architect and designed it, obviously. But
I'm also looking at the RFP that was put up by the city, and it says in that area they're talking 4 to 6 stories for 650 units.
we're not really talking about anything. I mean, 4 to 6 stories was in that initial draft. And this whole study now is in the hands of this committee and the consultants, and they have not made any recommendations to the village council at this point in time. That's what this process is for.
Was that something that we required by our commitment to abide by the requirements of the county ordinance?
No, we have not made any commitment to Miami-Dade County.
We can do whatever we want.
You can do anything you want. The village council can, provided they are able to take a plan that's acceptable to the county that allows for a minimum floor area ratio of 1.0.
Okay, so we're trying to get down to the nitty gritty here as citizens as to how this is going to affect us. And initially, as you presented these zones, it sounded like most of Pinecrest isn't going to have to deal with this. But it sounds like in the zone that is right up against the parkway, we're not going to be able to meet the 1.0 requirement without putting buildings in place. Is that true? I mean,
I think you just heard that on some of the smaller properties, it's going to be difficult to meet the 1.0 requirement.
Right, so that
So-
would mean that those properties would have to be redesigned and built up in some way.
Yeah, and this is going to be voluntary. I mean, it's only if a property owner wants to redevelop, would they have an opportunity to go to the 1.0 if it's adopted and put into our code consistent with the county's ordinance.
Well,
You know,
I guess, I don't want to take up too much time, but September 1st is not that far away.
right,
And as residents, we're kind of relying on your expertise
yeah.
as consultants to say to us, all right, you've seen this in other places. What is likely to happen here? What is the vision? And this is supposed to be the vision committee. And it's very hard for us to get our arms around what we're likely to see. As to whether, as
I
to
think
how-
you're going to see that a number of the properties on Pinecrest Parkway are not going to be able to meet the 1.0 FAR. You're going to see that it is probably possible on the larger parcels. And that's exactly what we're in the process. We just got the ordinance a few days before June 1st.
Uh-huh.
You know, so,
So we're not presenting anything to them anyway in September, right? I mean, we're preparing for 2 years down the pipe, right, to present some kind
we would
of-
like to have a recommendation for the village council's consideration this fall, yes. Then they can share it with the community and review it
But the September 1 meeting that they would do the second reading, we're not really going to be involved with that anyway, are we?
not by September. I don't think there's going to be a first reading in September.
Well, isn't that the meeting at which the 1.0 FAR will stand or not stand? as a
Oh,
requirement?
I'm sorry, the September 1 meeting is the Miami-Dade County Board of County Commissioners'
Right.
second reading of the ordinance, and it's my understanding they're going to vote on it at that meeting.
Okay.
But we're not going in to oppose it or whatever. That's not.
I've been to a couple of meetings, and I think they believe that they have pared it down so far that there is a demand for some intensity of development adjacent to the transit station, and this is their best offer. You can go, people have commented. I don't know what the final vote is going to be, but I'd be surprised if it's not adopted.
So September.
Taking a property such as Sunnyland, which developer built that, and decided to build something on that residential. How high can they go? How dense can they go?
Okay, Sunnyland right now could have a 4-story building with an FAR .73. The code does not allow for residential development at Sunnyland. Okay, it does allow for it at Gator Dadeland Plaza, and it does allow for it at Captain's Tavern. It allows for residential and commercial mixed use, 4 stories. And it allows for it up adjacent to 88th Street, but nowhere else, just in those 3 North Pinecrest Business Alternative Districts. Yes,
Those limitations are Pinecrest limitations.
correct.
Question, as someone who lives in the danger zone of 136 and a quarter mile in, what about our traffic? As it is, you can't get out of 136. It's
Okay,
impossible.
anybody that wants to develop any property that's very different from what is already there now is required to submit a plan for review by staff and the village council, and they're required to submit a traffic study, and they have to comply with the village's criteria for concurrency. They have to meet certain levels of service for traffic or mitigate.
I mean, because you can't get out of the mall across 136. I mean, it's ridiculous. And the traffic light, you have to wait. And can the county override this ordinance, say 5 years down the road when they start building, and they say, you know what, Pinecrest, we decided we don't like that. We're going to say, you know what, your ordinance doesn't mean anything to us now.
I don't know
So,
what
I mean, is there a possibility that, you know, Big Bad County can come in and say, too bad, so sad?
Apparently there is that ability in this county. I was surprised. I got a call one day real quick. I don't want to take up any more time in the committee, but I got a call when I was about 10, 11 years ago from Jeff Cohn. He was a transportation planner, and he said, Steve, I said, they're restriping a parking lot down at such and such a shopping center. We don't understand why plans weren't submitted to us for review. And I said, you gotta be joking. This is a charter municipality. This is the village of Pinecrest. We have our own regulations. We don't have to submit a restriping plan, a repaving plan to the county for review. He goes, oh, yes, you do. He said, it's in the charter. And he pointed us to the charter, and I called an attorney who was working on a project, and the attorney used to work for the county, and he concurred. He said, yeah, we do. It's a unique county. They do maintain jurisdiction over different things, even though we're our own community. So to tell you what the county's going to do in the future, I can't do that. Hopefully they won't.
So they can exercise eminent domain at their discretion? Is that what we're talking about?
I doubt that that's
a question.
That's the next
And it's whether or not the county home rule charter gives the county authority over municipalities under a sovereign immunity issue. And who is the ultimate authority within the home rule charter county? And basically, from what I've heard, and I've researched myself, what I've heard from Mayor Corradino, is that the county does have the ultimate authority in various areas, and then they could come in and rezone these areas were they to go forward with the original RTC, and we'd be standing there with, our fingernails in our hand. And it's just a question of who is the ultimate sovereign within this home rule county, and the county is the ultimate sovereign.
Correct.
So what they've done is Joe and others have lobbied the county and gotten them to reduce the RTC requirements to what Steve's talking about now. And the question is, how do we submit a plan within the next 2 years that will get the county to say, okay, that works for us, we're going to leave you guys to do your own thing.
Exactly.
Almost there, as I understand it, because we're at 0.73 in most of these properties as it is. The question is, what do we do? Home Depot, for example, does not allow multi-use zoning, so it can only be commercial. You can't put any residential units there now. So does Pinecrest adopt an ordinance that allows people to build multifamily or multi-use developments on that piece of property? That's what we're talking about. What the county will do in 5 years from now, who knows? I had that crystal ball, I won the lottery, I wouldn't be sitting here. So, they can do what they want to do, but it's taken them a lot to get to where they are now, because they've got a lot of pushback from the municipalities along this area. So it's what kind of an appetite do they have for this fight at a particular point in time. And they decided they don't have the full appetite to do what they wanted to do, so they step back from it.
Well, it'd be very distressing to go through this whole motion and then, we agree, yeah, that's great, okay, that's my neighborhood, and okay, I'm gonna go ahead and go with it. And then 5 years later, or when they start busting ground, and the county says, guess what? We don't like your plan anymore, and now we're gonna put up this big building, and now people that live 2 blocks behind there,
But there's no guarantees. What you're trying to do is you're trying to cobble together a plan that you think, we think, the village thinks, the council thinks will satisfy the county, okay, to get them to say, okay, we accept your plan and this is fine. You've got several exceptions, as Steve just pointed out. You can't touch residential, okay, can't do anything. Can't go in there and build an office depot in the middle of your housing development. Homes that immediately abut these pieces of property, even though they have a 1.0 FAR requirement in the quarter mile, you can still say, well, we're not going to, these properties right around this piece, we're not going to do that on this edge because it negatively impacts the residential community. So we've got some flexibility in what we're doing here, but you've got to come up with a plan that the county will say, okay, fine. So we got 0.5 on the edge. Oh, we're only going to do a little less than that or whatever, and push it all towards US 1 in the front and offset it in that way. You got to come up with some plan that the county will say, okay, you're close enough, but you will never have a situation where it's written in stone tablets from the mountain.
Right.
That it is what it is.
And I'd like to remind the committee, I mean, not the committee, but for those of you residents that are here, the purpose of this is not just to develop a plan that's going to satisfy the requirements of the county. The purpose of this exercise is to take the 2012 US 1 Pinecrest Parkway Vision Plan and develop a plan that is going to allow for the attractive redevelopment development and redevelopment of Pinecrest Parkway so that it is enhanced, so that it serves the needs of the people, so that it is a very attractive corridor consistent with the goals and objectives of the Village of Pinecrest. So it's not just to meet the minimum requirements of the county. That's what it is. And so they've got a lot of work ahead of them, and
So what I'd like to do,
Steve, that's your friction. The residents of the majority said, we don't want to see any change there other than what we absolutely have to. And, you know, your survey, 81% of the respondents were against multifamily mixed-use development in these areas. 90% were against any change at all. You then had a public meeting where the vast majority of residents who attended did not want to see any change. So,
yeah, I understand, and this committee isn't going to make any decisions, but they are going to use their expertise to develop.
That's the tension we have.
So let's do this, because I think your presentation got a little sidetracked, Steve. Maybe you could complete your final words on your presentation, and we could go back to yours. And then and you could, and then sort of finalize and wrap up your thing. I want to say one thing. This is a process. What we're going through is a process, and we're not going to be making any decisions, I think, of any kind before there's a final reading by anyone.
Correct.
I think that what we're, and you haven't missed much. There's been information gathering. We're all learning a whole lot from different bodies and trying to examine successes and failures and things of that nature. So we're putting it all kind of together and understanding. By the way, we're all Pinecrest residents as well. All right. So we're joining in to try to understand as best we can how we can merge all of these things and have an agreeable solution where we can say, listen, we did the very best we can do. You may not get 1. You may get 0.8. I don't know. But we'll find that out. But if you could just sort of finish off and wrap off your presentation.
I have nothing more to present. You know, you talk about the friction. Really, this committee and these professionals are going to develop a plan that they think is in the best interest of the village. That doesn't mean it's cast in stone or adopted. They don't have the authority to do that. It would be a recommendation to the village council, and the village council then would hold hearings and make a final decision like they always do. And you know, so and I think they do an outstanding job. But, it's just a planning process at this point. So.
I have one comment, and maybe it goes to something you've done and these guys have brought forward, is that in the notion of trying to understand, and I think it's a difficult proposition for everybody to understand the nuances of fractions of FARs, right? So you showed a nice diagram, and you stacked 2 buildings over the top, and that was a 1.0. Okay, so it might be interesting, and what we're talking about is, you know, that 0.27 that takes it from 73 to 100, right? And what does that 0.73 development look like when you do it absolutely according to code? And what prohibits you under the same code, the same guidelines, the same restrictions we have right now from getting to 1.0? Because I don't think it takes adding 2 floors of building to get there. I think it's just a manipulation of the building envelope. And by raising the building off the ground and putting parking or doing it, it's some minor manipulation. So it might be
space and parking.
Yeah, it might be an interesting study just to demonstrate to everybody what 0.73 looks like according to our regulations, and then what either prohibits or allows us to do a 1.0 under those same regulations. Because it's a thing we struggle with all the time in planning and figuring this stuff out. And that thing, I think, is a bit of an alarm bell to everything. This going from 0.74 or 73 to 1. And I think it's really, you know, it's a minor change in the envelope of the building, because you can already go to 4 floors. So, you know, you got to 1.0 by going 2 floors. So when you have the ability to go 4, you can get a lot of articulation in the building, you can do a lot of interesting things and get to 1. And I don't think you'll have to pass 4 floors, but I think in the diagrams and the things you do, it would be one simple, sort of site. Take a weird triangle site that we have and show what that complication is.
I think you nailed it, because if you go back to the diagrams that we shared, let's use the South Dayland, we weren't hitting the 0.73. We're actually probably 0.45, 0.5. So what is it going to take to get that extra 0.5?
And those were with all one-story buildings.
There was
there was a little bit of two, but there was no two along the highway.
Right. So what does that look like from a parking standpoint? Do we need to adjust our requirements for parking? Do we look at introducing structured parking? Does the open space, do we drop that down a couple percentage points to kind of give us a little bit more flexibility? That's exactly what I think the next process is. What would it take for us to get to 1.0? And what sort of concessions would we have to do to make that happen? And is that something that's feasible and something that the community can live with moving forward? I think that's the question. I think that's probably the next step that we would need to do, not only just on this parcel. I think we have a pretty good understanding that 1/4, that's going to be extremely difficult. But 136, what would that mean if we looked at a 1.0 FAR, right? Come back and say, all right, in order to get that, we need to do X, Y, Z. And I think that's going to be the next step.
Yeah, I think it can be done without adding.
Interrupter, I live right here. So if anybody here comes up in the morning and goes for a walk around that block at 7 a.m., it's already horrendous, okay? So I can't imagine looking at this design here going, are you mad? Are you mad about, just adding all those retail stores like the way it's laid out? I mean, you gotta walk the street. I mean, that's the big problem with everything that everybody's presented. Oh, Home Depot and, this condition. If you walk the streets, have you seen it? 98 or whatever.
This is not a concept. This was us.
This is what you can do today.
Yeah.
You can do this today with that
It
parcel.
doesn't work today. So we're in the city, we live here. I run that street every day, right? And it's crazy. You can see the emails I send in about traffic. Nobody follows traffic rules and that. I mean, so the idea is the revisioning of the park rate. But can we not take, if you have a net carbon, or we take one area and say, this is going to be the new Pinecrest Center, and then reduce all the other retail stores on West School, that will help traffic? I don't know. The revisioning, it seems like you're just redoing.
So I'm going to suggest something so that I know that at least I've given them the opportunity to give complete their presentation, because I think that I enjoyed the conversation we had today, because it became more of a round table, which is the way that I envisioned this to happen, all right? And so the conversation was really great. And so now as a courtesy to our guests, I believe you came you live Orlando.
Yes.
And he has a drive, right? So I like if you would just sort of complete your presentation, feel comfortable that you concluded, maybe, and then we could open up a little more conversation about that kind of thing.
I mean, Melissa, I don't want to speak for you, but I think from a presentation standpoint, what we want to share with you is what we've already shared. I think what we would like to get feedback from you, and I think this is where the conversation is starting to go, is how can we make this better, right? And what would it take for us to hit those minimum requirements? I think those are the conversations. So for us from a design standpoint, we want to understand more about what's important, what's the priorities, right? Because we're going to take those and use those to measure the design. We're going to go through different scenarios. All right, if we less parking, what would that do? Can we get the minimum FAR required, but perhaps instead of putting tall buildings next to the residential here, maybe we said we flip the diagram, we put it on the parkway, right? So we look at that. How can we also take better advantage of the open space? Right now, you have 12% open space, but from my perspective, I'm a landscape architect, I feel that this open space is fragmented. I don't know how usable it would be for you and how much of a value it would be for the community. So I would want to look at that and try how we can better maximize open space, right? How can we take better advantage of some of these setbacks? 20-foot setback is not small. That's a lot of opportunity to do a lot of great things inside there from a placemaking standpoint, from a purely landscape architecture or buffer standpoint that I think you want to dive into a little bit more, that would add a lot of value to your community. So those are a lot of things that, as we start to jump off into the design phase of this, we want to hear back from you about how we can make this better. Again, this is just us interpreting the code and seeing what you get today. This is what you can get today. I don't know if everybody thinks this is the greatest thing. I know I don't. We want to make this better. We want to work with you to make this better.
Look, I appreciate what you're saying. I appreciate you trying to figure out how to maximize the FAR and all that other stuff. But I think what you're missing is, how are people going to feel about the quality of life here? You know, what's it going to do to traffic? Are they going to feel more crowded? Are we doing this for the residents of Pinecrest, or are we doing this for someone else? Make it simple. I don't care what FAR is. I want to know how crowded it's going to be. Is it going to be room to park? Do I have to park 3 blocks away to get to the store?
I mean, if it weren't for the residents of Pinecrest, who would it be for? This is for the community.
Oh, I agree with you.
Yeah.
I'm not questioning that, but I mean, I understand. I think the presentation on the FAR was great. I understood it. But I don't know what it means in real life. What does it look like when you kind of go into a neighborhood and you see it that way? I know what I see when I drive down to Coral Gables now, and really, I hate to think that that's what's going to happen here. And, you know, the buildings look nice. I'm sure they engineered everything according to plan. But is that what people want to live in? Or they want to live there on life?
So if I could just kind of explain, like fill in a little bit of the blanks. We were hired to come up with an update to the vision plan that was done 10 years ago. In light of the fact that the county has created these station areas. And so it's an opportunity to say, this is how we want to develop, this is how we want to grow over the long term. So it's your plan and it's your vision and it's what you want. We're brought in to, as the experts, to kind of frame a lot of the conversation, provide you with the information to help make those choices. But we're not going to recommend something that nobody likes because we're here to work for you. So I just want to make that clear.
No, I appreciate that. I really do, but I think what you're getting here is a reaction from people who are having trouble visualizing ourselves.
Right.
What is this going to mean to me? How is this going to affect me? I moved to Pinecrest, I've lived here for years, I like the way it is. Now you want to change it. Okay, you can change it better, you're going to make less desirable, what's going to happen?
Right.
I know it's not, you don't have the solution yourself. You're helping us try to visualize it. But I think ultimately what the mayor has and everyone else is, how do you present it so we understand it, we can wrap our heads around what it's going to do to our lives here?
So that's the next phase. So right now we're presenting all of the base information and as a starting point, this is what you can do now. We're going to come back with some interim concepts and then there's going to be a visioning session which is going to be not the committee's meeting, but it will be for everyone towards the end of August where we'll present the different concepts so you can see, this is what this FAR looks like in this height and with these setbacks. And it's not just height and FAR that drives the way a project looks. So the example that I showed you of Coral Gables, it looks like that because they don't have setbacks and they allow a very large building footprint. And so there's a lot of different things that go into how a building looks in addition to the height and the FAR. And that's important to understand.
And I think that there's something to add to your presentation that you covered kind of quickly, and I think that for us, the residents, what we see from the neighborhood towards the street is also concerned. And so I think it's fair to say that as architects, we understand, we see three-dimensionally that there are these sight lines that you can adjust by creating a sort of wedding cake effect from the back, from the rear side of the property. So we have to be extremely conscientious of this notion of perspective, where you showed a quick diagram of the landscape and then a house, and then the street, and a two-story, and then there's a step back, and that wedding cake effect, you'll never see the taller building closer to US 1 from the residential section. And our job is to confirm that those sight lines and those setbacks along those streets, in fact, do what we think they're going to do, which is to create this sense that there aren't tall buildings over there. For those of you that drive around as much as I do in Coral Gables, and it seems very far from Pinecrest for me right now. The development that just the commercial property that was developed on Ponce de Leon, is it Ponce? Yeah. Ponce de US. No, not US 1, closer to Miracle Mile, that huge project by the Shore Plaza, right? I thought that building was going to wreck the single-story houses on the other side, closer to Douglas. I was convinced that was going to happen. And they created a kind of stepping stone effect where there are these 2 or 3 story buildings and then the taller buildings. So when you're on the other side, it doesn't look as massive as that horrible looking building on US 1 right there near the university, right?
I would say that that's true in just terms of visual dimensions, but there are other dimensions.
And
that
I'm
you're not
just
considering,
finished
which
it.
is
So
the density.
if you just let me
traffic.
finish the thought, and it's my thought, and I'll finish it in just a second. The objective of our committee is one of them, perhaps not the primary one, but one of them is in fact the residents, which I was sort of responding to the commentary that what happens when you look from your homes towards US 1 and what are you going to see? So right now, I haven't preconceived, but I do think that we're a village. I do think that it wants to stay at the scale of a village, and that's going to be very important. And that's one of those aspects that has to do a great deal with setbacks and those sight lines, and what is the angle? What is the angle of the vertical sight line when you're looking up? Now, there's a great deal more complexity to this, and I made it very simple. But it's not only the FAR that he illustrated, but it's those setbacks. And 30 degrees is a whole lot different than 45, right? So when you start looking at a wedding cake at 45, it's more a wedding cake. At 30, it's more like the ziggurat that collapsed. No? So those are things that when we get past what is 4 stories to 6 stories, or what is 4 stories parking garage underneath 6 stories, and those are some of the things that we're going to have to weigh. I don't know yet what's going to happen, and we're all going to sort of take votes and do this sort of thing as a group, right? But I do think that as we're talking about some of the concepts, I just introduced the village, the notion of the green space, the notion of open space. I think I sort of indirectly spoke about that. You know, that number of 40% is a big deal. There's 2 landscape architects on the board, and I think that the notion of those walkways that internally can go through the property are all part. And now this is if growth is going to be successful, it has to be positive to bring people that want to develop the property the way we would like it to develop. So if we establish the ground rules as through rules and regulations that we can point at, what are the sightlines we're looking at? What is it? What's a boulevard instead of a alley as opposed to a street? And I think that that's all very important. And with that, that's kind of my vision. It's things that matter to me a great deal. But I wanted to ask a question, Steve, because I didn't hear anyone address it yet. And it became a point where I remember And unfortunately, we have the mayor here, and the mayor's behind the mask, but I didn't recognize him at first. But something that touched off a lot of interest was density and dwelling units. And I think that we were able to get this whole issue of the dwelling units down to a sort of reasonable number. Somewhere we ended, I think, the conversation at about 30, and for residential dwellings, right? What happened with that? Can we bring that down just a little bit more, or?
Sure. So with regard to residential uses within the commercial zoning districts of the Village of Pinecrest, residential and commercial mixed-use development, residential, commercial, and office mixed-use development is permitted right now in the 3 North Pinecrest Business Alternative Districts. There's one at 88th Street, that triangular area just west of the apartments. There's one just west of the Palmetto on-ramp where you have Captain's Tavern Shopping Center there. And there's one that includes all of the Gator Dayland Plaza Shopping Center.
Yeah.
Those are the 3 North Pinecrest Business Alternative Districts that allow today a mixture of residential and commercial development. We talked about in earlier presentations of Pinecrest Gardens and the Banyan Pole in an earlier draft, we talked about the possibility of allowing for mixed-use development at 104th Street and 136th Street. That is something that this committee may want to consider and may decide not to recommend or to recommend. I don't know. But in terms of density, those are the 3 areas that allow for it now. And the recommendation initially was to expand the North Pinecrest Business Alternative Districts to 104th and 136th, limited to those areas across from the transit in an effort to address the county's concerns and considerations.
But that's sort of piped down some, hasn't it? Or?
And so we talked about 4 to 6 stories. Right now we allow 4 stories. We allow 4 stories now. And I said before, to get the 1.0, I thought maybe you'd have to add 2 stories. It's true, if you take away green space and you take away parking requirements, there are other ways to get to the 2.0, and the architects here will be able to demonstrate that far better than I can. But right now, we allow 4 stories. The county ordinance doesn't talk about density, number of units. The new revised ordinance is backed away from that, and instead, they're just imposing a minimum requirement of a 1.0 floor area ratio.
I'm going an exclamation point behind that, because you're very uniform in your presentation, and I want to make sure that everybody understands that that's a big deal, because that was a big rub as to the possibility or what was being demanded of an enormous, and I'm not even going to say the number because I don't want it to get sort of ugly or adversarial, but there was this terrible number of 130 somethings dwelling units per acre. And then it went down to 30, and then that caused another shockwave. And now I guess that shockwave went through all of the communities, and so they're not talking about that anymore. They're talking about FAR, which is a real manageable thing that we can work with.
Yeah, the initial county ordinance, I think, allowed 36 units per acre in the first quarter mile and then 60 in the second quarter mile. And we did the math and we thought if it develops at that intensity, it's going to increase the population by a factor of about 9 to 10. Right. And we're going to go from 20,000 to 180,000, which would have been obviously not in anybody's best interest.
So for the group that wasn't at the Banyan Bowl when that conversation happened, all right, you're lucky. Because it was an all-out assault on government, all right? But I think that as a result of that, things sort of backed off, and now we're at manageable numbers that I think we can handle this. I think we can handle this. We can handle a few, some of these code requirement limitations, we can handle that very well. And if we can, and I think we still have to kind of keep in mind in the back of our head what is a reasonable number?
Right, and I don't think we had ever recommended or talked about anything more than 25 to 30 units per acre, because our comprehensive plan right now already has in it goals that suggest 25 units, support 25 units per acre, and we've got multifamily districts that allow up to 50 units per acre. So that wasn't terribly outlandish, but it's far less now, you're correct.
In this moment, the residential area in the village has a maximum height, the two-story new mansions, maximum height of 35 feet.
That's right.
So the commercial had the limit of 45 feet. So if we have two-story beautiful houses, 35, if the commercial can be maximum 70 height, so you can have the 6 stories, build, or 5 stories with nice first story thing, and then lots of different things could happen there. So
Scaling back or I would, scaling back to the core, or where the core is further in the line, in the perspective, no?
Right.
Right. The other thing I wanted to mention about, the gentleman made the comment about the traffic and concerns with the traffic the way it is now. There are tools that we have to address that. If you limit parking on new development, you'll limit the number of cars, and typically the transit-oriented development, which we showed you examples of, reduces the parking, the allowable parking, because people that live near transit traditionally don't want to use their car, and so they have fewer cars in their household. So there are ways that you can get around the traffic issues, and the whole idea of transit is to provide options for people to get around.
If you were just, again, anyone on the committee, go and just walk the street at 7 a.m. to 8, you'll see that everybody from US 1 cuts through Pinecrest. They get to the only 2 crossings, 88th Street, and, it's horrible.
There are ways of addressing that.
Okay, and then the other one is they get on the Palmetto, right on 102nd, right near the, what's that street, near the Anthony's coal stone over there. That's insane. It puts speed bumps in, it's the worst. So, I love when you guys say, oh, if we can do it, and we're sitting there going, you don't do it now. We don't control that now, and yet you want to expand this. And again, I apologize, I'm taking more time. I'm sorry.
No. Now, I think we're in the open session of conversation back and forth with the consultants. So it's appreciated. I agree with you, by the way. I understand the traffic thing. That's why I try to get up at about 5:36 to miss the swarm of people going back and forth. So I understand, yeah.
Now, what I find amazing about the RTC is it assumes everyone is working downtown. And that's really, it's just in Manhattan, it's not the city. And where people do that. When I first moved to Miami, and that's when I started talking about the trail, I thought that's not a bad idea. Come from New York, I always took the subways, I took whatever it was, always commuted. But now, I work downtown, it was great. How many people work downtown now? How many people are coming from Homestead to go downtown? There's a certain fallacy here. I wonder who's really driving this thing. Is it the real needs of the people or developers?
As Steve touched on, and that's the elephant in the room here. We have a transit system that's essentially worthless. It doesn't go anywhere.
You're right.
25 years ago, I was on the Prime Coverage Council. We did the shred thing where Miami-Dade County wanted to build all the way out to US 1, get 5 feet off the sidewalks and all this transit and everything else. They built the busway behind my property down there and that whole 9 yards. We've made no progress since. Now, adding to that mix of a transit system that goes nowhere, we have a whole new economy. We have a whole new way of doing business. My accountants, Paul and Ross, 27th Avenue and Bay Shore Drive, the whole building, poof, they're in a new place now. They're in a third of the space. Everybody's downsizing. Metro Rail is going to, the transit is going to keep dropping and dropping and dropping. People are only going to use Metro Rail to go downtown, to go to Bayside, go to a restaurant, do things like that, because eventually that's where it's going to be. We're all working out of our homes. Retail is declining. Here we are talking about we're going to build more stuff here on US 1, yet retail is declining, office space usage is declining. Drive over to Sunnyland. I'm born and raised in Pinecrest. How many empty stores are in Sunnyland right now? I've never in my life seen empty stores in Sunnyland. Never. I've seen people fighting trying to get into Sunnyland. Now, the post office building is empty. I don't think anybody's in that anymore, or has ever moved into it. Excuse me, it was remodeled and nobody moved in. So that's kind of the elephant in the room here, is that here we are, we're trying to accommodate Miami-Dade's grandiose failed plan. We're going to try and accommodate them. Why? Why do we accommodate something that's a failure? Pinecrest should move. Pinecrest, Palmetto Bay, the city's on the highway here. We need to move in our own direction, do our own thing, and let them continue to fail. Don't let them affect us like this.
How long has the overlay district been in place?
The North Pinecrest Business Alternative District, I think, Mayor would know. I think since about 2010, 8, 9.
How many applications have you had for anybody to take you up on that special ordinance?
We have one that is very interested in going into the Captain's Tavern property, but that would be it as far as I.
So, I mean, my view of it, and it might be simplistic, but, basically one of the things we're trying to do is, in a way, throw the county a bone, right? You throw the dog a bone. We've got these overlay districts in the north area already. We're talking about maybe we pull it down to the south area. Maybe at 104th may not make much sense, but you could put it there because nobody's going to develop it because it just won't work with the restrictions of the boundaries of the lot, right? So put it there. It won't work. But again, pacifying them in the same thing that we already have in place, and no one's taken it yet because it doesn't make a hell of a lot of sense to tear all this stuff down to come back and do it to gain 0.27 FAR on a big site. So there's a whole lot of conversation. I appreciate all this stuff, but from planning and watching cities grow and planning cities myself, I look at this stuff and go, look, you've got this thing in place. They could build 4 stories right there right now. They could build it right up along the road. They could do the whole thing. It's been in place 10, 12 years. Nobody's even thought about doing it yet. So there's a lot of apprehension about what this is. But again, I think the diagram that shows that incremental change between the 0.73 and the 1.0, and the fact that no one's even taken that on because it's not enough of an incentive to tear down what's there. And even if you did and you brought it back, it would be very marginal. The difference of what how you're going to perceive that developed property is going to be a marginal difference.
Are you saying that if we try to make these accommodations to make RTZ happy, we won't have the investors that would want?
We don't have them now. We already have an overlay. Look, what I'm saying is that overlay's been there for a while, and basically, if we offered it in the other zone, which is at 136, which is where they want to see something, it's an appeasement. It's throwing the dog a bone, but nobody's picking up the bone. But nobody's picking up the bone.
I would like to agree with you, but if you look at Carl Gables, I mean, somebody.
But those are totally different zoning codes. Totally different. They have nothing.
They've taken the city beautiful and made it into a monster.
But they have nothing in common, and they've allowed for 12-story buildings, they've allowed for all that stuff for the last 20 years, and that's what they
What I'm saying to you is that they'll find a way to fund it.
So what, and I think that the point that you made, forgive me, I'm just butting here.
I've been standing here, go ahead.
For just a second. One of the things that plays into all of this, and absolutely right on why people want a piece of property, is that it has to be feasible when you calculate out and you do the feasibility study. And when I've done that math for projects, it really comes down to the number of parking spaces that a small property has. If if you can't maximize that property because you have the requirement of lot coverage, parking, and setbacks doesn't allow you to build enough on that property, you're not gonna get nothing done. And people have, what's that?
Perfect.
That really, it really comes down to that. And now, I will say one thing, I'm gonna add one thing. I agree completely with throwing throw the bone concept, but in the place of all things are possible, if we can establish a set of rules and guidelines and requirements that in fact, when something may be really considered as an optimal plan by a good developer, that when they do bring it in, it's going to be something like the breakers, or something that you can look at and say, boy, I'm glad they built that in my neighborhood, because it's just wonderful.
Something like
and
The breakers.
like the breakers, a project that
I don't know
has
what that is.
in Palm Beach, West Palm Beach. So I just wanted to, I want to say that, and by the way, there's some concern about having to go do this in a couple of years, because God forbid, the hypotheticals start to play, and then you get fearful. Usually these plans take about 10 years. You know, then you sort of revisit it every sort of 10 years and try to tweak it and refine it. So if we set a set of standards that are so good, then the next time around, it's just going to be that much easier to control things that make it better. So I wouldn't, there hasn't been that, it doesn't seem like there's been that much that's happened since 2012. So I would say that I'd like to maybe, we've got 20 or 30 minutes left. And we have a few things to sort of cover to close out the meeting.
Could I say a second?
He's
twice.
Yeah. But he's a big guy. He's a big handsome guy.
Slow down, man.
All right.
Go, I'm sorry.
My old friend.
May I go, John?
It's your
Where
turn.
do you want to go?
It's your turn.
It's my turn? All right.
Yeah, go.
The two things I want to say is, one, with regard to the North Pinecrest development areas that exist, the reason, quite frankly, I think they haven't been utilized is because, as you guys point out, the sites don't really allow for development there. The cherry here, and the issue, and the concern, and the area that's going to get developed, depending on what you do, is the Home Depot site, the Publix site, and the Macy's site. And somebody's going to come in and consolidate those, and now you're going to have a huge, or potentially huge project. So you got to keep that in mind. Right, 12 years has gone by, 15 years has gone by, and nobody's developed the Gator shopping mall, because it doesn't make sense to develop the Gator shopping mall, no matter what we've done over there in terms of incentive, 25 units per acre, et cetera. But they are going to come in and do Home Depot. Somebody will come in and buy those sites and consolidate sites depending on what you do. And if you do something that allows 7 stories or 8 stories or an FAR of 1.5 or something like that, somebody will come in and consolidate that. And that's what I don't think the vast majority of the residents want.
But I don't think
I think we need to focus. We need to focus in the visionary plan. What happens? What happens with the properties you just described? What happens when you do consolidate 2 or 3 properties, or 2 or 3 of the smaller pieces of property? What does that begin to look like?
And right now it's 0.73, 25, and the maximum height of 4.
Right,
And
so
that's not a big, so.
I agree.
So what?
I agree. So I think that as long as we all understand 3-dimensionally what that looks like, then I think that everybody's going to be a little more comfortable with the idea of that. You know? But I think that they're going to re-envision what this thing could look like once they take these ideas and they create these.
But we need your input.
Somebody let me speak, please let me speak. I mean,
John,
with all due
It's your turn. It's your turn.
None of you, I think, live next to one of these areas. I live right next door. The shopping center is my neighbor, okay? Dayland Plaza. So, your perspective is correct. And I think the plan that was designed for it is okay. I mean, we had to go through this fight when they did the 4 stories and like that. And that was because they wanted residential in there because the federal government required a certain amount of residential with every commercial unit. What you gotta remember is also to look at what are the requirements of the properties that they build. I mean, I got air conditioners right across my wall that make noise, and then I gotta go to the city, and then they cut it down. Nothing is covered, so I think if you could maybe throw in, from an architect standpoint, a maintain, and also like having any kind of service equipment coming next to residential, you know, I mean, I hear those damn garbage trucks and.
You're talking about the back of the house.
And the semis right behind my house. So, I mean, those are essential, and I don't think we really have that in the code. So, I mean, I'll make that contribution.
So make in your list, back of house.
Yeah, he's wrote it down.
Okay, so when he's talking about all of
Yeah,
that.
we talked about it too. I think, I haven't specifically looked at that in the code, but I'm sure that now new development has to address that. And that's something that we can address in our planning work. I think that's important.
And it's like if they put a parking garage next to a residential area,
Yes.
you gotta cover up because those guys,
That's in the
alarms go off and noise.
Cooling towers and all of the other stuff
Yeah,
that are parked that are noisy. Yeah.
Right. And I think 12 and a half units is plenty.
So make maybe acoustical criteria, decibel level requirements.
And the other thing would be, for example, we're zoned duplex, okay? But maybe it should be rezoned townhouse, then duplex, and then single family, and that puts a buffer up, because none of our homes are 2-story homes, they're single-story homes.
Right.
So I just wanted to get those points.
Townhouses are not permitted in the duplex districts.
I'm sorry?
Townhouses are permitted.
No, you guys rolled it back. It's no longer, it went back, correct, Joe?
No.
I'll check it out, but I'm sure it is.
2-story duplex. I think she had.
Townhouses are allowed in the duplex districts.
Yeah.
That was what you combined two last, but I don't think it's acceptable. I'm sorry.
No.
I know.
Yep.
Oh, okay. I just have, I guess, a technical question. How does parking relate to the FAR? Hearing you talk about buildings and the FAR, the 0.5, 1.0 as the building envelope itself, but then versus the green space, and what about where does parking play?
So what happens in the master plan? The planners evolved this notion of density from high to low. All right. So the gentleman was talking about the types of apartments that kind of fulfill these levels of density, right? Until you have the estates, and then you have it eventually goes to some level, or it scales from high density to low density, right? So then one of the things that we have to control how the city looks are these guidelines and these requirements, and they're prescriptive. They're pretty much like a doctor requires so many cc's or milligrams or whatever. It's prescriptive, right? And everybody has to meet that. So what happens is that there some of the ones you've already heard are the more visible ones of height and stepping back and sight lines and all that. And those are all all of those rules happen at the same time, including parking. So for example, in a medical office, you may require a medical office may require 10 spots per office.
It depends on the use. I mean,
I totally understand
So when you get to residential, when you get to residential, my question, I'm sometimes a little too, so I'm gonna try to cut it down. So if you go from 2 parking spaces to 1 parking space, you have a lot less parking for a residential unit versus 2. And so in order to have an apartment and work that apartment in a feasibility plan for the people that own the place to make money, they have to have the right number of parking to have the right number of apartments, and the right number of apartments at the right price.
But how does that affect the FAR?
So FAR, the floor, so that the FAR, if you have parking on the ground floor, all right, and you have a certain number of parking spaces, it squeezes the building to a minimum amount, and sometimes the numbers don't work out from a feasibility.
So that is the parking.
The FAR is not counted towards, so the parking is not counted towards the FAR.
Right.
It does.
But it does not.
No, it
So
doesn't.
FAR is just their usable square footage. Parking is always excluded unless there's some cities that can include it.
So
But
it
it
would
does
be part
count
of the
towards the
green
height.
space.
But it does count towards your height. So if you're gonna have 2 stories of parking, you can only do 2 more stories if you're in a zone that allows 4 stories. So that's an important distinction. The parking doesn't count towards the FAR, but it does count towards the height.
So you could have, so there's another number which is lot coverage. So you could have all the lot coverage you want, but if you just want all the parking to be on the ground floor, it's gonna reduce the amount of area your building could sit on the ground floor. So there are all of these
It would be
technical
reducing
regulations.
green space.
So you have a combination of green space that you must have. You must have. Then you have the parking criteria that you must have to have off-street parking. Unless you do some plan where you have a little building somewhere else and people can park there, and then you can have as much green space as you want because you've got, and that was a conversation, but that some municipalities do that kind of thing. In our case, I don't think it's going to work. We can consider it, but I don't think it's going to work. So all of these limitations and requirements will restrict the footprint of the building, and once it does that and the height, the building has to be feasible for someone to want to buy that property and build on it. And that's
We
going to
don't
limit
care
it.
about who wants to buy it and build on it. All we need is a plan.
Yes, I agree. There you
You
go.
mentioned about parking though. Pinecrest has always had very strict parking ratios in comparison to other cities. So the retail we currently have, I know you mentioned we only have like 6% restaurants. I think many of the owners have issues bringing restaurants because of the parking ratios. So that is something I think maybe to look at because things have evolved. There's more people, less people, using cars. You're trying to make it more walkable, so maybe the parking ratios should be looked at this time.
So if I could comment on parking real quick. We obviously don't want more parking to require more parking than is needed. I mean, we don't want wasted asphaltic parking lots that just create heat island effects and things like that and take away from the attractive landscaping and buildings that you could otherwise have. So our parking ratios are based on studies that the Urban Land Institute has done for different types of uses, and that does change. The Village Council did in the last several years, they reduced the parking requirements for restaurants specifically in an effort to attract more restaurants and allow for more restaurants. We have lower parking requirements for fast food restaurants, fast casual restaurants, fine dining restaurants. And then we're allowing now, we've excluded warehouse space, we've excluded coolers from the building area that generates parking requirements. So the amount of parking now that's required for restaurants is significantly less. And we should reduce parking spaces to the extent we can without creating a problem. I work for another community. I remember there was a restaurant owner that lobbied the village council and the zoning board members and said, we got to reduce parking requirements. And so the village council member directed staff to look at parking for requirements for restaurants. We did that, we took it back to the planning board and they said, Steve, we've done this. You've only been in the community a couple of years. We've done this 3 times now. We've reduced restaurant parking requirements 3 times for this guy. We can't do it anymore. Well, that council member became very upset, put a lot of heat on the the city manager. The city manager came to me. We quickly drafted something. The city council agreed. They reduced the parking requirements again. And almost within, it was within a year and a half, it seemed like months, people were complaining. People were coming to these restaurants, there was no place to park. They were parking in swales, they were parking in people's yards. They created a parking problem now that it become a political problem.
Yep.
And so you have to be, we want to provide not too much parking, but enough to, it's like Trader Joe's. They meet all of the village's parking requirements, but they still don't really have enough parking when that store is really busy. Parking backs up in US 1. But maybe there's an opportunity to further reduce parking or to allow parking within structures that will allow for better quality development. And that's something we need to look at.
I remember, I think it was at the former meeting that we had where that also you guys mentioned that you wanted to expand the sidewalks. And one of the ways you would do that was going into the parking lots against US 1. Is that still in consideration, or I didn't hear anything about the sidewalk expansion really today.
The problem with US 1 is, it's my understanding the Florida Department of Transportation widened US 1 and they took property away from the commercial properties adjacent to it. And so that's why you have more narrow properties in one reason. To expand the sidewalk, you would have to.
I don't think it's necessary, by the way. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that's something you guys mentioned. I think you're.
The only way to do it would be on an easement or something like that. It would be on your property. It would be on the commercial properties. And I don't know if that's something that this committee's going to look at or not. You're suggesting it's not necessary.
I'm suggesting it's not necessary.
So the Trader Joe's that you brought up, why can't we force them to put a second story on there for more parking? I mean, if you go again, on Saturday morning, on US 1, things back up across the street. So why, again, is that a limit? I mean, cover the vision, you're on US 1. Why couldn't we force them to put more parking in and second story there, right? You're only one
Well,
story.
they meet all of our parking requirements, and they even provide more parking than the village requires. And so now we recognize that the store is so popular that they've got a parking problem. I think it's hard to go back and force them to.
But could that be something that we add to the laws later on? As
You can make a deal with Burger King.
parking problems, and so
So
they
they
can
know
add
that
that part of this, of changes, if you know, I live right there, I have to find,
Yeah.
On that screen, I can talk about parking, on that previous slide there, one more back. That one right there, you see on the tip there's two apartment complexes. Well, where do they fall into the zoning? I mean, those are each, I think, 3-story, I think one's 3-story, one's 2-story, and one's that size.
Yeah, those are all apartments.
That one right there, that was 2 stories, and then the one in front, I think they have 4 or 5 or 6 stories.
Right.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I think that one of the things that we can consider, and I don't think it's out of bounds, is that the possibility, the potential of municipal type of parking structures that could house cars and I remember with Coral Gables, or those, I did not like to park in those buildings. It took me a while to figure out where they were. And now as I drive through Coral Gables, I don't even consider parking along Miracle Mile.
Faster, right? So it's not so that's what developers do. They buy big parcels of land and assemble it. So you want to be proactive and anticipate that and tell them, no, this is how we want it to look.
Right, like I think everybody's thinking of the sidewalk along US 1. I think you need to think of a sidewalk that meanders off of US 1 in the front of all the shops and banks, that someone could actually walk away from US 1 and walk away, walk away from the cars. I mean, that would be a more interesting way of thinking.
Or spin the property so that the back of the person had a problem with the back of the plaza on his property.
Is on US 1.
The back is on US 1.
Yep.
And force, on the inside, put the sidewalk
between, between the residential and the commercial. Spin to the back is not, so you don't see it in the US one. That was up on traffic too. You're talking about reducing parking to reduce traffic. That doesn't work like that either, There's a lot of things like, I agree, that sidewalk is horrible on US one. Spin it, put it on the inside. Get rid of it, put a wall there, put a 10-foot wall. I don't know.
I don't know. I don't think anybody's knows the answer. Just trying to think about it.
I'm fine. Do you have anything else that you needed to say?
No, I think we covered it. At the next meeting, we're going to start to show you some interim concepts based on what you told us. So if there's anything you'd like to see that you haven't told us about, now's your chance.
So with that invitation, and Steve, since public record, what I did since I felt that maybe it was a request that was too grand. When I said this compared to other cities, I had people in my office since the last time look at all the zoning codes of all of the municipalities, and I put together the ones, and I'm going to share. This is new business, right? So I'm going to send it to Steve. It's a PDF. This is all the codes, and I synthesized them into one page and a bunch of examples. All right, for all of the different municipalities that I think, I could be wrong, okay, that we compare ourselves. And so if it's possible, I'll talk about it at the next meeting. But I have examples for each of the buildings that we've actually worked on for each one. So for example, Boca and West Palm and Coral Gables, and then I established heights and limitations and all this sort of information with roads that are El arquitecto Mateo, Ronnie. So what I last time I said, well, not all of these places have an 8-lane highway in front of them. So I went to all of the buildings I've ever worked on where it's 6 to 8 lanes. And I tried to show an example of a building like that next to 6 to 8 lanes. Okay. So it's not like, oh, it's in the inner city. No, it's right there against something big. And just so that we can talk about it. Not that this is what we're going to do, but at least you have all of these heights and all these things and all of these densities, and that it could be passed around. I could be wrong.
Well, that's wonderful information. Do you want to provide for a brief presentation of all that at the next meeting?
I can do that. I'll do that.
Thank you for putting all the stuff on your.
Well, no, since I didn't want to lay.
Dayland South, right? Because this is Kendall Drive. And
That's where like the DSW.
that's the ramp. I think that's the
CBS.
ramp. Yeah.
So that's, they don't across the street, that's right there, the West one and Kendall Drive.
They are located within
the quarter mile.
Hold on,
For sure, a quarter mile, but it's
Yeah, you're
very
within a
special.
quarter mile, so this goes back to your suggestion about 6 storage or whatever. Is it gonna be profitable? These areas here will be sold, and they will put in as big as high-rise as they put in. Those two properties.
But if you only get FAR 1, how heck of a big building are you gonna get in there? And then one's more than what you're allowed to put in there now.
Okay, well, I'm just telling you that is enough property there to start building higher.
Yeah, if you had an FAR that allowed you to build a high rise. You don't have that.
Anyway, so the parking there, if you go there today, and you walk around that property today, they park all on the outside of the easement every night.
I live 50 feet away from those. I know it very well too.
Okay, so I'm just pointing out that it's not just these zones here, everything is impacted. Especially the parking, that's why I want to end up.
And I think that's a good
residential properties
Is
are
excluded.
excluded.
But that's not residential.
Sure it is. Apartments are residential.
All right, so we'll look at that to make sure that we control future growth in that area based on FAR and all of the other issues.
I'll look into that and report back at the next meeting. Mayor Corradino, did you have anything you'd like to?
No, I wanted to thank everybody for being here, and I wanted to say I think it's a great exercise. We won The county threat is gone. We won the ability to plan ourselves, and that's what this process is about, right? The county said try to do these things. I think this is the opportunity for us to do what we've always done and be creative and think about these things and how they want to work in the future. And it's ours, and we can debate it in this room and wherever else, and as always, we'll come to a consensus, and we'll make compromises, and we'll do what's best for the community. One size doesn't fit all, and this is about better quality design when we come out of it, and we don't necessarily have to live up to anything that anybody else wants, right? So that's all I have to say, and if anybody wants to stick around and chat, I'll do it for as long as you want afterwards. Thank you. Thank you.
We need to discuss next meeting.
Yeah, we're gonna have a second.
The next,
When do you want?
So we'd like to come back, I believe it's around in 3 weeks,
I'm not available on the 12th or through the 15th
The 9th.
of
the 9th.
August.
The
The
9th.
9th, that would be
The
okay.
9th, is in 3 weeks from today. So we can provide you with some interim concepts and to talk about the visioning session and the structure of it, how we want to run it, what we want to get out of it.
Did everybody get a chance to sign up?
August 9th?
Yeah.
Okay.
What was the date?
You're available?
Okay, August 9th.
Yeah, please check your calendars because it's important that we have a quorum. We just barely have a quorum this evening because 3 people did not come.
No, I was.
At the same time.
45 minutes, I drove like 100 down.
at 6 o'clock, no?
No, it's at 5:30.
5:30?
5:30.
Okay.
And the intent is to have the visioning session towards the end of August. Right, so, depending on the feedback we get from you, we might need more time to revise, but the intent is to come back and do.
So I'm still.
I may have a deposition, I have a deposition that day, I don't know if it's gonna run late, is there?
On the 9th?
Yeah, how about the 10th? Or the 8th?
Yeah, I mean, we've been meeting on Tuesdays, but if you want to change that to a Monday.
Yeah, could we change it
He's
to
gonna sign
Wednesday,
in
the
real
next
quick,
day?
because,
So would you
he
like
wants
to
to
do
be
it
up
the
there.
8th or the 10th?
The 10th would be preferable.
I have no problem.
you can fill out, we
All
can
right,
make sure
so
we
perfect.
updated all the information.
That'll work. Does that work with everyone?
So the next meeting will be the 10th of August at 5:30 in this room. And that's the final item on the agenda, is questions and answers. Any other questions?
August 9th?
August 10th.
Yeah.
So, a motion to adjourn?
A motion to adjourn.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right.
Thank you. Just wanted to say hi to these